Hello, I'm Malte. I'm a UX designer here, and today I'd like to explain three things to you. First, why you're not your user, what user testing is, and why is so critically to understand. Before we start, I'd like to tell a story. It involves beer. It's about an idea that probably a few of us have had in the past. It's about opening up your own bar. And you've cared for everything, right? Just imagine you open it up, and you've got the beer, and you've got the cocktails and some nice seating. And before the grand opening, you invite a QA engineer. And the QA engineer comes, and he comes to you at the bar, and he orders a beer, and he orders 0 beers, and a million beers, and a lizard. And that's perfectly fine because you're prepared for it, you've got it all there, and all is good. And on the grand opening, the first real customer comes in, and he comes to the bar and he asks you where the bathroom is. And you have no idea because you forgot to build it. And while that's just a joke I stole from Brennan, who is an engineer at Snapchat, it's a great introduction to the topic. Because this is a typical problem a lot of software development teams have. They forget about the most important person in the team, which is the user. I want to explain why you are not your user and why it's so important to understand that. You're not your user because you're special. And I don't mean the typical kind of special, I mean atypical. And you're atypical by definition when you work in software development. When you work in software development, you've decided for yourself that you want to create software that's going to be used by other people. And that puts you in the top 5% of computer literacy. So the probability of everyone in this room here being in the top 5% is quite high. Obviously, not everyone in the company is in the top 5, but we can just assume that most people here are. And by the way, this is the first of 4 bold statements that I cannot prove, but it's a talk, so you shouldn't care. Because I can't prove this, I want to explain it in a more familiar way, and in a way that you all have experienced it before. I want you to meet your Aunt Deborah. That's your Aunt Deborah, and that's you. That's a typical guy or girl working in software development. And I want you to think back of a situation you all have experienced before. You're at this family gathering, like Christmas gathering, and you get asked countless numbers of technical questions, right? You can't hear it anymore. Like your Aunt Deborah coming to you and asking you how this new X-ray scanner app works, and you can't anymore. You just have to say, Deborah, no. And when you think these questions are, not the smartest one because they're obvious to you, you're making the mistake that is important to understand. Deborah's understanding of tech is vastly different from yours, and that's perfectly fine, right? Deborah's old or older, and it's a generation thing, and that's perfectly fine, but you need to understand that Deborah might be your user. And now I want to get back to the survey, because that's actually the first and the only one I actually can prove. And to prove this, I want to show you a study real quick. It's the distribution of users' computer skills. It's from 2016. It was conducted with over 215,000 people in countries all over the world. And they created pretty graphs like this. I want to quickly explain how it works. They asked over 215,000 people and gave them tasks to conduct on their computers. And based on the number of tasks you were able to do, you would be put into one of 4 categories. Level 1 and below is terrible computer skills, and that's actually their naming and not mine. Level 1 and 2 is poor to medium computer skills, and level 3 is strong computer skills. Now, we'll take a look at Germany, right? That's our main target group. And as you can see, 31%, 34%, so 1/3 of Germany's population has, and I quote, no to terrible computer skills. And that's your Aunt Deborah, obviously. 61% have poor to medium skills. And just for you to understand what a medium skill level in this distribution is, a medium skill level is if you're able to use the reply all function in your mail client, that puts you into medium, right? So just for you to get an understanding of this. And then there's you as a typical person in software development, and you're probably in the top 5%. All right, I want to give you a real-life example. If you look at the screen, and I asked you, where would you find the menu here? Obviously, everyone in this room would be like, what? Why would you ask this? It's obviously the hamburger menu on the top left. And that's perfectly normal. You all know this pattern. But if I ask your Aunt Deborah about it, she would start tapping on the camera because she has no clue, because she has never used this icon before. And that's perfectly normal because people have to get used to pattern. And If you think this was, a question that's obvious to everyone, and everyone on the whole Earth would know what the menu icon on this was, this is called the false consensus effect. And that's the most important thing of why you are not your user. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias, where you think that your opinion is the opinion of everyone else, and you overestimate so much how other people think in regards to your own thinking. So I want to give you a real-life example you probably can relate to. I want you to think of your touchpad or trackpad on your MacBook. There's two ways of scrolling on a MacBook. You can put it into natural, so the element sticks to your fingers, or you put it into non-natural and it goes the other way around. And everyone I've spoken to, they've said, I obviously do it natural, or they say, I obviously do it non-natural, and they couldn't possibly understand how people would do it otherwise. Because if you give them the MacBook with the wrong scrolling direction, they're useless with it. They can't work with it. And if you think that your way of scrolling on your MacBook is the only way, and other people, they're kind of out of understanding, that's a false consensus effect. I made a pretty graph to sum this up. Your understanding as a typical guy or girl in software development is way higher than Deborah's. And as I said, that's perfectly normal. It's a generation thing. But the problem is you make assumptions based on your own understanding of tech. For example, the menu icon, you know it, all your colleagues know what the menu icon is, but your user might not. But you think only about your own understanding and not about your user. What you should do is base your understanding of the app and the design and the software about your users, so about Deborah's understanding of tech. So to put it in layman terms, if you can't be Deborah, at least talk to Deborah. And I hope by now you finally understood that you are not your user, you are not Deborah, and we get to the second part where I explain when to do user experience user testing. And I want to start with the second bold statement, which I actually cannot prove this time. And this is you can avoid 85% of issues with just 5 usability tests. And for that, I want to show you a typical process of software development. I want to say now this is strongly generalized, so this might not be the exact way of how we do it here, or how other people or other companies do it, but it's just a generalization. If you look at this, it's the start and the end of a software development project. And at the beginning, the design team does their work. They do 1 or 2 or 3 design iterations, and then the devs start working. They work in sprints. And at the end of each sprint, QA starts testing. And the red lines you can see is bug fixes or problem fixes or stuff that the devs have written once and have to fix after the QA team finds a bug. And this can take countless loops. Actually, the bug fixing might go on after the normal end line of the project. That happens quite a lot as well. And my proposal is UX usability tests. As you can see, they start way earlier. They start in the design area of the project. So before you even start coding, before the first line of code is written, you start making or conducting UX user tests. The idea, and that's my proposal, do this user testing stuff here at the company, is that you do way less bug fixing. You do less bug fixing, you have less logic problems to fix, you have less stuff to work on later in the process. Now you might say, okay, can you prove this? I can't. This is bold statement. I cannot prove number 3. Devs spend 50% of their time fixing bugs. It might actually not be that far from the truth, but I can prove it. Let's sum this up. If you want to do user testing, in general, do it as often and as early in the process, because you can avoid bug fixing and problems later in the process. Now I've spoken for 10 minutes about user testing, and I haven't explained what user testing actually is. And you might be like, Deborah, what are you talking about? And I want to quickly explain what user testing is. In an easy, sad way, user testing is testing something with your users before the first line of code is written. I hear you ask now, how would you test with a user when there's no code, when there's no app? Thank you for the question. You use prototypes. Prototypes is nothing but a simulation of the real thing, of the real software. Prototypes can range from simple prototypes like paper prototypes up to actually real digital app prototypes where people like your Aunt Deborah had no way of knowing that this is not a real app, but an actual prototype. I want to start with paper prototypes. This is an example of paper prototypes. They can be as simple as you sit in the kitchen, you take a napkin and you sketch down a real quick interface and you give it to your colleague sitting next to you and you validate the idea you're having. If you do it more professionally, you do something like this. You draw wireframes and then you put them literally in a cardboard box. It's as easy as that, and you give it to someone, and you watch them use it. It has so many advantages. You can do this in literally 10 minutes. While we are sitting here and you're listening to me, you could have done a paper prototype. And it's great for early in the process, right? When you have a few ideas and you want to validate them, you sketch up a paper prototype, go to a user, talk to them for 10 minutes, and you can, understand if it works or not. Obviously, it also has the disadvantages because people like Endeavor and tech versatile people might get confused because it's so far from the actual digital app. So later in the process, we use so-called digital prototypes. They are at far end of the complexity range and are used later in the process, for example, like at the end of the design stage. For digital prototypes, it's quite easy as well. You just take the screens. These are screens from a pitch we're currently doing for Fröbel, and the design team has to do the screens anyways, right? So you take the static screens and you literally click on one of these items and you link it to the next screen and you're basically done. That's your first prototype. You do this with all the items that you want to test with, and then you push this to your mobile device and you have a working prototype. So that's basically it. The next step you do is you take this prototype on a device and you give them to users. These are totally real users. This is not a staged photo. You give them tasks. For example, when we tested this app, we tested it for Fröbel, a potential client, and I gave them tasks like book a holiday for tomorrow. And then I sat there and I listened to them talking. And we gathered around 10 insights that I didn't think about it when I designed the screens from just doing 2 user tests, 3 user tests for 20 minutes each. One of these insights I want to show you today. This is one of the schedule views we made. We made around 4 and we tested them, all of them. We tested like 4 screens with all participants. And what was surprising for me is that the top row of numbers there, when I designed it, it was meant as the time. So it's 7 a.m., 8 a.m., 9 a.m. And when I tested it with 3 people, all 3 of them said, what I thought this was the date, so the 7th of November. And you all are here nodding, and obviously it is. But the thing is, when you're in your tech bubble, right, when you're in the top 5% and you design on this thing and you work on it, you can't see this and you don't get the second opinion. So this is one of the few insights that we got. Now, the most important thing about user testing and important thing about when you do user testing is how you get the insights out of people. So when I just read the App Store reviews and gather feedback based on this, you don't actually get what the people feel, but you get what they think would be a great fit because they thought about it. So what you do is when you do user testing, you tell all the participants to think aloud. That means you give them a task, and while they are doing the task, they have to think aloud, and everything that they feel about the app, they have to say out loud. And I want to misuse a famous quote for that. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. That's what Henry Ford said. He meant something completely different, but doesn't matter right now. So if you want people to actually tell you what they feel, let them think aloud. And that's basically it. User testing is really easy because you can range it from paper prototypes to digital prototypes, and you can decide for yourself how complex you need it to be. And before we finish up, I want to give you 3 reasons why we actually here at Smart Mobile Factory should implement it as soon as possible. And the first is cash. If you implement user testing, it'll save you so much money in the long run. If you think back to the graphs I showed, when you implement user testing, you can avoid the bug fixing that has to be done later in the process. And that saves time. I've got my bold statement number 4. It's pretty emojis this time. The statement is that if you fix something in development, it's 10 times as expensive as fixing it in design. And fixing a problem in a deployed app is 100 times as expensive as fixing it in design. That's bold statement number 4. I cannot prove this. The second reason why we should implement user testing is time. That's the same reason as number 1, right? If you fix problems early and you find them before the app gets deployed, they are easier to fix. You have to do less bug fixing and less developer time has to be spent on it. The third reason, and that's the most important one for me, is the user experience. In my opinion, the only way you can actually find out what the user is thinking, what the user actually needs, and what he feels about the software you develop is by sitting there and watching him think of Endeavor, clicking the camera icon a lot. You won't see that otherwise. And if you want to improve the user experience, and in my opinion, as a company that creates software, it's our job to do the best quality of software you can, you should do user testing. And before we finish up, I want to tell you, if you have any questions regarding UX methods like user testing, please ask me. If you have any questions regarding your software development, please ask a user. Thank you. Questions?
Are we doing this on any project now or planning to?
Yeah, that's a fake question, by the way. And we're currently doing it in the objectives and key result for Fröbel in my squad. And we currently have a pitch for a project that we're probably going to do. It's for the ZFK. You probably have heard about it. If not, it's a project for people that are deaf. And that's quite interesting for me especially, because you all finally understood you're not Deborah, right? And you're not your user, and you can't possibly think of into the head of someone that's deaf. The communication is too different. So we do have to talk to them to understand how to build the app, how to build the software. There's no argument not to do it there.
Does it make sense to implement user tests when the app is already deployed?
Of course, it makes sense everywhere. It's just more expensive. And remember the 100 cache icons I showed you? Fixing something like that in a deployed app is the hardest, because the client has to agree. And for user testing, you do it at the design stage. The client doesn't even have to know about it if he doesn't want to pay it. And surely you can. I mean, just read the App Store reviews of the apps we already produced here at Smart Mobile Factory. You can see all the problems the app might have. So if you do user testing, you'll get these insights and probably 100 more. So sure, you can fix it, but it's harder.
How do you usually do user testing? Do you invite the user groups, and how do you decide on which people you choose?
That's something I sadly can't decide. That's something the client decides, because he has to pay for it. In a perfect world, I would test with real users 10 times before the first line of code is written. For each feature that's implemented, I'd invite around 5 people per test, and I'd sit down them for 20 minutes. But the reality in most companies is that I'd sit down with someone like you, in-house colleagues, and I'd test with someone that's not on the project. And that's more realistic, because the people are here anyways, and you can just sit down for 20 minutes. It depends on how good the client understands that he needs user testing.
For example, for ZFK, how are you going to do that?
Well, currently the plan is that we'll be there for 2 days or 1 day, and just sitting there and listening to the people doing their work. That's not actually user testing, that's called user research. And after that, the plan is to go over there with a prototype and talk to the people who work at ZFK, because they're deaf as well, so it's your target group. And for the first step, it would be just talking to them. Any other questions? Cool, thank you.